We're learning some new details today after the Smithsonian Institution decided to remove references to President Donald Trump's 2 impeachments from an exhibit on the American presidency. This is the National Museum of American History that we're talking about here in Washington, D.C., that removed the content last month.
We should note, despite President's removal from the exhibit, it still includes information about the impeachment.
Okay, so Washington, D.C. is absolutely in a spiral right now, and we need to talk about what just went down in federal court, because this isn't just another political dust-up. This is potentially the biggest accountability moment we've seen in modern American history. A D.C. federal court has just set in motion proceedings that could lead to the impeachment of not just Donald Trump, but multiple members of his administration. And the implications of this are staggering. We're talking about cabinet members, top White House aides, senior officials across the board, all potentially facing impeachment charges for what lawmakers and legal experts are calling systematic constitutional violations, obstruction of Congress, and abuse of power on a scale that eclipses anything we've seen before. The court's decision to move forward with this case has sent absolute shockwaves through Capitol Hill, with emergency committee meetings being convened and both parties scrambling to figure out what this means for the balance of power in Washington. What makes this moment so unprecedented is that we're not just looking at holding one person accountable. We're looking at the possibility of holding an entire administration to account for alleged crimes and constitutional violations that legal watchdogs say went all the way to the top and filtered down through every level of executive power. This is the kind of moment that defines whether our system of checks and balances actually works, or whether it's just words on paper that powerful people can ignore.
Republican strategists have to be scratching their heads tonight. Making Zoran Mamdani and his communist ways the face of the Democratic Party was their top midterm strategy. Trump, at least for now, blew that up tonight. The draconian ICE raids have overshadowed any credit Trump could have been receiving for tightening the border. And as for the economy, with or without official data, people know that they are struggling, and many are. But what most people do not realize is that whether their purchasing power has weakened and their job security gets worse, the Trump family and their crypto empire in the last 10 months has made them billions, supercharged by his administration's moves to deregulate the crypto industry and pardon a crypto king who also happens to have close business ties to the Trump family.
Let's break down exactly what's happening here and why this court action is being called the most consequential accountability case since Watergate. House Democrats, along with multiple legal advocacy organizations, have filed extensive documentation with the D.C. District Court demanding a comprehensive impeachment inquiry that goes far beyond Trump himself. These filings include whistleblower affidavits, leaked internal memos, sworn congressional testimony, and what sources describe as a mountain of evidence showing coordinated efforts by administration officials to circumvent legal checks and balances. The allegations are sweeping and damning. Illegal deportations carried out in defiance of court orders, deliberate violations of congressional appropriations, systematic retaliation against whistleblowers and critics, and what the filings describe as a pattern of undermining federal law at every conceivable level. Fox News reported that Representative Al Green and several other Democratic lawmakers have filed what they're calling privileged impeachment motions, describing this as the broadest impeachment case since the Watergate crisis that brought down Richard Nixon's presidency. The court's acceptance of these filings and its decision to allow proceedings to move forward has essentially lit the fuse on what could become the most explosive political and legal battle of our generation. We're watching constitutional machinery that hasn't been fully deployed in decades suddenly roar to life, and nobody in Washington seems entirely prepared for what comes next. Now, here's where this gets really interesting and really serious. The impeachment articles being proposed don't just name Donald Trump. According to reports from SN News and other outlets, these articles specifically cite systematic abuse of power, unlawful executive orders, and coordinated obstruction of Congress, and they name high-profile cabinet officials and senior advisors alongside the former president. We're potentially looking at impeachment proceedings against people who served as Attorney General, Secretary of Homeland Security, White House Chief of Staff, and other positions of enormous power within the executive branch. The evidence compiled by House committees allegedly shows that these officials didn't just follow orders. They actively participated in planning and executing policies that violated constitutional constraints on executive power. Whistleblowers who worked inside various departments have come forward with testimony describing meetings where officials discussed ways to get around congressional oversight, how to ignore court orders they disagreed with, and how to retaliate against federal employees who raised concerns about illegal activities. One whistleblower affidavit reportedly describes a cabinet meeting where officials openly discussed defying a federal judge's order, with one cabinet member allegedly saying that they would simply ignore the ruling because they felt the judge was politically motivated. If these allegations are proven true, we're talking about a level of contempt for the rule of law that goes beyond any single bad decision. This would represent a coordinated attempt to place the executive branch above judicial review and congressional oversight. The legal framework being used here is fascinating and unprecedented in its scope. Impeachment, as most people know, is the constitutional mechanism for removing federal officials from office for high crimes and misdemeanors. But it's almost always been applied to individual office holders, presidents, federal judges, cabinet members, one at a time. What makes this case so extraordinary is that legal scholars and House Democrats are arguing that when an entire administration engages in coordinated constitutional violations, the remedy must be equally comprehensive. They're essentially saying that if you have systematic corruption and abuse of power that runs through multiple layers of government, you can't just impeach one person and call it a day. You have to hold everyone involved accountable. Legal experts quoted in the court filings argue that this approach is not only constitutional, but necessary to preserve the integrity of our system of checks and balances. One constitutional law professor told reporters that if an administration can violate the law with impunity by having the president give orders and cabinet members execute them, and then only the president faces consequences while everyone else gets off scot-free, you've essentially created a system where accountability is impossible and the rule of law becomes meaningless. The precedent being set here could fundamentally reshape how we think about executive accountability, moving from a model where we punish individual bad actors to one where we recognize that systematic violations require systematic accountability. The evidence that's been presented to the court is reportedly extensive and damning, and some of what's been made public is genuinely shocking. According to SN News, the impeachment articles cite specific instances where Trump administration officials allegedly carried out deportations of individuals who had active stays of removal granted by federal judges, essentially ignoring direct court orders because they disagreed with the legal reasoning. There are allegations that the administration systematically defied congressional appropriations by redirecting funds that Congress had allocated for specific purposes and using them for entirely different projects, most notably the controversial border wall construction that Congress had repeatedly refused to fund at the levels the administration wanted. Whistleblowers have provided testimony about retaliation campaigns against federal employees who raised concerns about illegal activities, with some employees allegedly being reassigned to career-ending positions, having their security clearances revoked without cause, or being subjected to internal investigations designed to intimidate them into silence. There are reports of leaked memos showing administration officials discussing strategies to undermine the independence of inspectors general, the watchdogs who are supposed to investigate waste, fraud, and abuse within federal agencies. One particularly damning memo allegedly shows a senior White House official writing that they needed to find ways to get around the Inspector General because that office was becoming too effective at uncovering problems within their department. What's particularly explosive about this case is the bipartisan nature of some of the outrage that's emerging. Now, let's be clear. The impeachment push is being led by Democrats, and most Republicans are still circling the wagons around Trump and his administration. But there are cracks appearing in that unified front, and some of those cracks are significant. Several Republican lawmakers who have traditionally been Trump allies have privately expressed concern about the scope of the allegations, particularly the claims about ignoring court orders and defying congressional appropriations. These are conservatives who built their entire political identities around respect for the Constitution, separation of powers, and congressional authority over spending. And they're finding it increasingly difficult to defend an administration that allegedly trampled all over those principles. One Republican senator told reporters off the record that if even half of what's in these whistleblower reports is accurate, the administration engaged in behavior that no conservative should defend, regardless of partisan loyalty. That kind of language from within Republican ranks is significant because it suggests that the wall of partisan protection that has shielded Trump and his team from accountability in the past might be starting to crumble under the weight of the evidence. The timing of this court action is also significant and worth examining. We're heading into the 2025 election season, and this impeachment case is going to dominate the political conversation for months to come. Democrats are clearly hoping that exposing the full scope of alleged constitutional violations will energize their base and persuade independent voters that accountability matters more than partisan loyalty. They're betting that average Americans, regardless of their political affiliation, will be troubled by evidence of systematic lawlessness at the highest levels of government. Republicans, on the other hand, are preparing to frame this as a partisan witch hunt, another example of Democrats using legal proceedings to overturn the will of voters who put Trump in office. They'll argue that Democrats have been trying to impeach Trump since the day he took office, and that this latest effort is just more of the same. The political battle lines are being drawn, and both sides are preparing for a fight that will likely extend well into the election season and potentially beyond. What makes this different from previous impeachment efforts is the sheer volume of evidence that's apparently been compiled, the number of officials being targeted, and the fact that a federal court has deemed the case worthy of moving forward rather than dismissing it as purely political theater. Let's talk about what lawmakers are actually saying about this case, because the rhetoric coming out of Capitol Hill is intense and revealing. Democratic representatives are using language that we rarely hear in official proceedings, calling this a fight to restore constitutional order and sending a message that no office is immune from accountability. Not the president, not the attorney general, not the cabinet. Representative Al Green, who has filed impeachment articles against Trump before, told reporters that this case represents the culmination of years of documented abuses that can no longer be ignored or swept under the rug. Harrogate that the evidence of coordinated constitutional violations is so overwhelming that Congress has a duty to act, not just to punish wrongdoing, but to prevent future administrations from believing they can operate with the same impunity. Other Democratic lawmakers have pointed to specific incidents: the family separation policy, the use of federal agents against protesters, the interference with mail operations during an election year as examples of a pattern of lawlessness that went far beyond normal policy disagreements. They're arguing that we crossed a line from having an administration with controversial policies to having an administration that actively undermined democratic institutions and the rule of law. The legal advocacy groups supporting this impeachment push are equally forceful in their arguments. Organizations that have been tracking Trump administration actions for years have compiled databases of alleged violations, policy reversals that defied court orders, and instances where administration officials made public statements that directly contradicted established law. These groups argue that the systematic nature of the violations proves this wasn't just incompetence or bureaucratic confusion. It was a deliberate strategy to expand executive power beyond constitutional limits. One legal scholar associated with these advocacy efforts wrote that the Trump administration essentially conducted a stress test on American democracy, pushing every boundary to see what they could get away with, and that the results of that stress test revealed dangerous weaknesses in our system of accountability. The argument being made is that if we don't hold this administration fully accountable for every violation, we're essentially giving future presidents a roadmap for how to undermine democratic constraints on their power. The stakes, these advocates argue, go far beyond Trump himself. This is about whether the American system of government can defend itself against authoritarian tendencies. The connection to broader issues of checks and balances cannot be overstated here. The American system of government was specifically designed to prevent any one branch from accumulating too much power. And the tools for enforcing that balance include congressional oversight, judicial review, and ultimately impeachment for officials who abuse their authority. What this case is testing is whether those tools actually work when an entire administration is allegedly committed to pushing past constitutional boundaries. If Congress can only impeach one person at a time while everyone else in the administration continues the same behavior, then the check doesn't really work. If courts can issue orders that the executive branch simply ignores without consequences, then judicial review doesn't really work. What we're seeing right now is essentially the immune system of American democracy activating in response to what it perceives as a serious threat. And whether that immune response is successful or not will have enormous implications for the future of democratic governance in this country. Legal historians are already comparing this moment to other crisis points in American history. Watergate, obviously, but also the conflicts between Andrew Johnson and Congress during Reconstruction and the constitutional battles of the New Deal era when the Supreme Court was striking down major legislation. The historical precedent aspect of this case is particularly fascinating when you dig into it. During Watergate, the impeachment process focused primarily on Richard Nixon himself. Even though it was clear that many of his top aides and advisors had participated in the cover-up and other illegal activities, those aides were prosecuted criminally, but they weren't impeached because they had already resigned or been fired. What Democrats are arguing now is that waiting for criminal prosecution isn't sufficient when the violations are ongoing and the officials are still in positions of power where they can continue to abuse that power. They're saying that impeachment needs to be used more aggressively and more broadly to actually serve its constitutional purpose of protecting democratic institutions. Critics of this approach argue that using impeachment so broadly could weaponize it and turn it into just another partisan tool rather than a solemn constitutional remedy. But supporters counter that the alternative, allowing systematic violations to continue unchecked, is far more dangerous than any risk of partisan abuse. The debate over how to use impeachment powers in cases of widespread governmental misconduct is one that constitutional scholars have been having for decades, but it's never been tested quite like this. Why does this story matter so much right now beyond the obvious political drama and legal fireworks? Because what we're witnessing is a fundamental test of whether American democracy can hold powerful people accountable when they operate as a coordinated group rather than as lone bad actors. The traditional model of accountability, identify the wrongdoer, investigate them, impeach or prosecute them individually, breaks down when you have systematic violations carried out by dozens of officials working together. If the system can't adapt to hold an entire administration accountable when the evidence suggests coordinated wrongdoing, then we've essentially discovered a massive loophole that future authoritarians can exploit. An aspiring dictator could theoretically stack an administration with loyalists, have them all participate in constitutional violations, and then rely on the fact that Congress and courts can't process that many accountability cases simultaneously to escape consequences. What this D.C. court action represents is an attempt to close that loophole by allowing for comprehensive accountability proceedings that match the scale of the alleged violations. Whether this attempt succeeds or fails will send a powerful signal about the resilience of American democratic institutions. The political fallout from this case is already being felt across Washington and will only intensify as the proceedings move forward. Members of Congress who have been on the fence about how aggressively to pursue accountability are being forced to take clear positions. Cabinet members and senior officials who are named in the impeachment articles are lawyering up and preparing their defenses, which could lead to a series of public hearings that expose even more details about how the administration operated. The 2025 election is going to be conducted against the backdrop of these impeachment proceedings, which means voters will be making decisions about the future direction of the country while simultaneously watching the legal system grapple with the alleged sins of the recent past. This creates an incredibly volatile political environment where anything could happen. Public opinion could shift dramatically as new evidence emerges. Unexpected witnesses could come forward, and the definition of what constitutes acceptable behavior for government officials could be fundamentally rewritten. We're in uncharted territory here, and honestly, nobody knows exactly how this is going to play out. The international implications of this case also deserve attention, even though they're getting less coverage than the domestic political battle. America's standing in the world has always rested in part on the perception that we're a nation of laws, not men, and that our democratic institutions are strong enough to hold even the most powerful officials accountable. When an American administration is credibly accused of systematic constitutional violations and the response is a shrug and partisan protection, it undermines that global reputation and emboldens authoritarian leaders who can point to American hypocrisy. The fact that a federal court is taking these allegations seriously and allowing comprehensive impeachment proceedings to move forward sends a different message that American democracy might be tested and strained, but it's not broken beyond repair. Allies who depend on American leadership in defending democratic values around the world are watching this case closely, and so are adversaries who would love nothing more than to see American democracy tear itself apart. The stakes extend far beyond our borders, and how we handle this moment of crisis will reverberate through international relations for years to come. So, where does all of this leave us? We're at the beginning of what could be the most consequential accountability battle in modern American history, with a D.C. federal court igniting proceedings that could result in multiple impeachments across an entire administration. The evidence being presented suggests systematic constitutional violations. The legal arguments being made could reshape how we think about executive accountability, and the political implications are absolutely massive heading into an election season. This is about more than partisan point scoring or political revenge. It's about whether our system of checks and balances actually functions when it's tested by officials who are willing to coordinate in pushing past constitutional boundaries. The court's decision to move forward with this case represents a crucial moment where the judiciary is asserting its role in defending democratic institutions, and what happens next will define American democracy for a generation. We're watching history unfold in real time, and the outcome of these proceedings will either restore faith and accountability or confirm the fears of those who believe powerful people have become untouchable. Either way, Washington is in absolute chaos right now, and that chaos is only going to intensify as this case moves forward through the coming months.